This morning, we commemorate Palm Sunday. It is a holiday on the Christian calendar upon which, excuse me, bless me, that Christians celebrate Jesus' kingly entry into Jerusalem. It was a beautiful event. And yet, for those of us who know the story, it is also an event filled with melancholy. I think the confession of Peter is very much like Palm Sunday in that regard. Just like Peter, the crowds understood that something important was happening. But just like Peter, they would soon be dismayed by what that something was. We can fall into that very same trap as we think about the work of God in our world and in our lives. Sometimes we fall victim to the temptation to conform the hope that we receive in Jesus to our own desires for worldly comfort, power, or happiness. How does that happen? How did Peter so miss, as we'll talk about Friday night, what Jesus was really up to? And yet, why was his confession so needed and so important? Like so many people in our world, Peter, the rest of the disciples, everyone in Galilee, they were people who needed hope. They were people who needed to know that God still cared and that God was still at work in their world. Why? Well, you've heard some of the reasons before, but it's really important for us to list them out again, just so we are reminded of the desperate situation in which Peter and his friends and his family members and everyone around him found themselves. And so, once again, we can walk in their shoes, seeing the world and seeing Jesus through their eyes. As we've mentioned several times before, the people of Israel had experienced centuries, literally centuries of foreign oppression. The Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans had all laid waste to part or all of this land. Had killed its people, had siphoned off its resources for themselves. And even if one was not technically enslaved, so many aspects of human agency had been taken from you. Now, there's another factor that maybe you haven't thought about, and we haven't talked about as much, but I think it's just as important as these centuries of foreign oppression. There were also centuries of misunderstanding, of isolation for the people of Israel. They weren't like all the rest of the people. They didn't worship gods made of gold or silver or stone or wood. They didn't participate in the pagan festivals that so often created unity within the civic space. And for that reason, and many others besides, Greek and Roman authors sometimes presented Jews as haters of humanity, as misanthropic. Have you ever felt isolated? Have you ever felt misunderstood? Magnify that on an unimaginable scale. Everybody you know has that experience. And on top of these sort of these factors that are external to the Jewish community, there is the corruption and at times even breakdown of the religious institutions that gave Judaism its life. People had nowhere to go sometimes to address their isolation, to address these problems that come from being an oppressed people. Now, it wasn't always that way. There were synagogues that worked very well, that took care of their people. We see that all over the Roman Empire. Jews who were freed from slavery by other Jews, they paid big money to do it. It's not just in recent years that Israel has used whatever means necessary to reconcile its hostages. That's been going on for thousands of years. But the big picture institutions, particularly the temple, were seen to be corrupt and had little that they either could or would do to help the populace. But of course, not all the trouble was political or cultural or social or religious. Some of it was deeply personal. Poverty, disease, and especially demonic oppression made people's lives excruciatingly difficult. Have you ever realized, have you ever thought about, there is more talk about demons in Matthew, Mark, and Luke than there is in the whole of the Old Testament, and perhaps in the whole Bible combined. The forces of evil were on the march. It's no wonder that Jesus got frustrated with his contemporaries, that they just didn't see it. He saw it every day. It seems like every time we turn around, Jesus is throwing out another demon. But perhaps what Jesus is doing is not half as remarkable as the fact that there was a demon every time Jesus went around a corner. And that's besides all the havoc that was wrought by poverty and disease. Now, when you take all of that together and you look at the challenges that average, everyday Galilean or Judeans dealt with, it's not surprising that some of them just gave in, that some of them just gave up. Philosopher Jeff Holzclaw argues that humanity, that being a human, is defined by agency and intimacy, by the capacity to be near to others and by the capacity to exercise independence, to exercise control over our own lives. And sometimes people just lost it. And they would lash out in violence or in abuse to try to regain some kind of control over their lives. Or maybe they would try to numb the pain either through alcohol or sex. And here's the thing about prostitution. It gave you the illusion of intimacy. You could assuage your feelings, by the way, that you probably don't even really understand, if only for a little while. But here's the problem with sin. It turns in upon itself. It destroys those who perpetrate it, and it destroys those who are victimized by it. And that only adds to everybody else's misery. We've seen this in the modern world. Now, I could leave preaching here and go to meddling, but I'm going to wait to do that a little longer. Let's use another example, one not exactly from our own culture. I've been watching the news for 40 years. And throughout that whole time, occasionally, periodically, I've seen stories like we're seeing right now about all the corruption and violence in Haiti. But here's what I never knew. All that corruption, all that violence are downstream consequences of the tragic story of Haiti's history. Haiti was colonized by the French, and they populated it with African slaves, people who they stole right out of Africa, took them to Haiti to work the sugarcane fields. And of course, France got rich. You know what happened to the Haitians. Well, finally, the Haitians got some initiative. They got tired of it, and they were one of the first Caribbean nations to kick out the colonial power. A slave revolt defeated the French, and they were free, or so they thought. The French imposed debts and tariffs that left Haiti in debt for 130 years. And here's the bad part, folks. The United States cooperated with the French in that disgustingly unjust imposition of debt. Why did we do it? Well, partially because France was our ally in the Revolutionary War, and partially, you can bet, because Southern plantation owners did not want their slaves getting any ideas from the Haitians. Is it any surprise then that real societal health, real civic society has had a hard time taking root in this country, in Haiti. This is what happens when evil has its way in a country. It's not just Haiti. We see it around the world. And by the way, if Satan can't oppress your country by having it taken over by a foreign power, he'll divide you from within. That's what he did to the Romans. That's what he did to the Greeks before them and the Persians before them. And that's what he is doing to us. So I want you to imagine yourself as Simon Peter. All of a sudden, you're palling around with this Jesus fellow, and you know in your bones that God is up to something because you see it every day. And all of a sudden, your heart dares to dream. Israel had been promised for centuries that God would intervene on their behalf, rescuing them from their enemies. And now Peter is daring to dream about what that might mean for him, what that might yield in his time and his place for his wife and his mother-in-law and his brothers and sisters and the people in his town. He's starting to dream. That's the setting for our text this morning. And as you read Peter, and as you read how the wheels are turning in his mind, you ought to be thinking forward from Matthew 16 to Matthew 21 because the crowd is doing the same thing. Now what happens here, okay, in our text, Matthew 16, what happens? Well, Jesus acts like a good Socratic teacher. He asks questions. He uses questions to teach. That's what Socrates did, so we call it Socratic instruction. But a lot of good teachers have done it. And in these questions that Jesus asks his disciples, first, who do the people say that I am? And second, who do you say that I am? In those questions, Jesus is killing two birds with one stone. Obviously, he's asking them how they perceive his identity, right? That's the actual content of the question. But what they say about his identity also says something very important about what they think God is up to. So if someone says, well, I don't think this Jesus is anything, that also means that they probably don't think God is really up to anything at this time in their life and history. If, however, they think Jesus is a prophet, now that's a different story. At least God's doing something. But it still may not be what they really want him to be doing. But now, what if they say, well, I think he might be Elijah. Now there was a view in Jesus' day that Elijah had to come first. We'll talk about this next Sunday morning. There was a view that Elijah had to come first. And then the Messiah would appear. Well, at least then you think, okay, the clock is finally ticking. God's final intervention on our behalf isn't here yet, but we can see it on the horizon. But notice how Peter answers the question. He doesn't choose any of those options. What does Peter say? He says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Peter is saying that God's final work is here. It's actually happening. Now, by the way, I want you to notice something about what the crowds said about Jesus. Yes, when people asked in Jerusalem, well, who is this guy? They called him a prophet. But when they're actually praising him on the road, they call him Son of David. That's a messianic title. They're saying the same thing. Peter, and then the crowds after him, are daring to dream that God's final intervention on behalf of His people is not just on the horizon, but it's actually here. I remember one time a friend of mine in high school, he was driving home late one night, and he was listening to, you probably don't remember this genre of music, it was called ska. And it was heavy metal combined with big band instruments. So you had all these horns going off, right? And all of a sudden he comes over a hill, and the car that's coming to meet him, it's on a 2-lane highway, the car that's coming to meet him has their brights on. And he hears these horns and sees this bright light, and he's like, yes, Jesus is coming back right now. And then he keeps driving. He's like, oh man, it's just the car. But that's how Peter, that's how the crowds are beginning to allow themselves to think. It's not quite as sudden as what my friend experienced. It's slower. It's more gradual. But they're starting to think, wait a minute. Everything that we have dreamed of, everything that we have hoped for, everything that we have waited for and pleaded for is finally coming to fruition. And Peter's confession is particularly important because of its context. You know, we saw last week when the disciples confessed Jesus as Son of God. So why should we think that this is particularly remarkable? Well, because it's not in the immediate aftermath of some miraculous event that keeps the disciples from drowning in the Sea of Galilee. They've had time to think. They've had time to sit back and look at the evidence and evaluate it. And evaluate it in a more objective is probably the wrong word, but it's the closest one we can come to. More objective manner. It's not the result of relief that they're alive. It's not the result of an adrenaline burst. It's the result of the opportunity to sit back and go, okay, I've seen this and this and this and this and this. Wow. So, how does Jesus respond? How does Jesus respond to this declaration on the part of Peter, this opening up of Peter's heart? He responds in 3 ways. He affirms, he expands, and he clarifies Peter's vision for the future. He begins by affirming it. Notice what Jesus says to Peter. Hey, it's not flesh and blood that revealed this to you. It's my Father in heaven. This did not come from any sort of human insight or ingenuity. It came as a revelation of God. God is at work in Peter's life. That is good news, isn't it? It's good news if you're Peter. God is revealing things to me that really matter, that are really important. Now look at that next sentence there. I think it's the next sentence. Anyway, Peter's name did not start out as Peter. He was Simon, son of Jonah, right? Well, in one fell swoop, in one sentence, Jesus does two things. First of all, he says that Peter's confession is so important that it will become the foundation of everything that Jesus is doing. And then he takes that proclamation, he takes what he has just said about Jesus' confession and transforms Peter's very identity. So much so that he changes Peter's name. Little Greek lesson here. Your name is Peter, in Greek, Petros. And on this rock, Petra, I will build my church. One of them's masculine, the other one's feminine. It's almost the same word. Okay? But it's the confession that's really the big deal. Now, I'm shortcutting a lot of controversies that have happened in the church. Okay? We can come back and talk about those some other time. But right now, what I want you to see is how Jesus is affirming this dream that Peter has had the audacity to dream. Your confession, Peter, is going to be the foundation of what I'm doing. And it's going to be the foundation of your own identity. And if all of that wasn't enough, Jesus grants Peter almost unimaginable authority. Now, when Natalia read this morning, she read the New International Version, and she didn't read the text notes that are in the NIV. There's an alternate translation there, and it's actually more consistent with the real grammar that's used. It's just that it's really awkward in English. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. It's called a future perfect tense. And basically what it does is it takes you to some point in the future and then helps you to look backwards from that future point. So it's sort of like, it's sort of like if we said, well, by next Sunday afternoon, Roy will have eaten 3 hamburgers and 6 hot dogs. Okay? Which is why we had to take him to the hospital. But that's what you're doing here. Now, sometimes we can do that in English, but it's just easier to say, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it is so certain that it's already taken place. That's the kind of authority that Jesus grants this Peter fellow. All because he dared to dream what God might be up to. But then Jesus expands Peter's vision. How does he do that? I tell you, your name is Peter, Petros, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church, ecclesia. Now, ecclesia was a very common Greek word. It was used by Greeks all over the world to define their civic assemblies. And it was used by Jews to describe their religious assemblies. You see this word in the Old Testament. Well, I should say in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It uses ecclesia. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, I am going to create a new community. Now that's something that was not in the standard understanding of what a Messiah was supposed to do. Why would a new community need to be created? Why would a new assembly need to be called? Just that right there should have gotten Peter asking some questions, right? But Jesus keeps going. He says, I will build my ecclesia, my assembly, my church, my community, and the gates of, the NIV gets this right, the gates of Hades, not hell. Hell is Gehenna. That's the Greek word for hell. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Now, what does that mean? What is Hades? Hades is the place of the dead. Jesus might as well have said the gates of death. That's right. The gates of death will not prevail against it. And remember, gates are a defensive structure. So what Jesus is saying is that this new community that He is going to be creating, that is founded upon Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah, of Jesus as Son of God, is going to kick down the gates of death itself. And what do you think that means for those evil, sinful powers that erected those gates in the first place? Yep. There is gonna be a fanny whooping. And it's gonna be more than that, isn't it? Because we remember Revelation 20, don't we? Death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. They are utterly destroyed. Now that is amazing. But Jesus isn't through. He's also going to clarify, or we might even say correct, Peter's vision. Now he's going to do more of that in the text we're going to look at Friday night. Okay? So there's going to be more of this, but I want to whet your appetite a little bit for that. The first point is, notice, it's Jesus who's doing the work. It might be Peter's confession that's the foundation. And Paul will even later say that the building, the whole building that is the church, is founded upon the apostles and the prophets. Not just their confession, but upon their ministry and their identity, right? But they are still just building stones. It's Jesus who does the work. It's Jesus who builds the house, as Hebrews 3 would describe it. Okay? Now, the second way that Jesus does this, the second way that He kind of clarifies Peter's vision, or at least alerts Peter that there's more to it than he imagines, is that He tells the disciples, don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah. Now, why does He do that? Well, obviously, it's because the crowds don't get it. They certainly don't understand what Jesus is up to. But it's also that the disciples themselves don't get it. They don't fully understand what God is doing yet. Now, how do we pull all of that together and apply it to ourselves? Because I know that we've covered, actually quite a bit of ground here, and you might be kind of thinking, oh my gosh, what is he going to do now? Well, we want to take this and remember that we ourselves are Peter. And we ourselves are that crowd on Palm Sunday. Peter got something really important right. He looked to Jesus for his hope. That is a good and beautiful thing. It is a thing worth celebrating. But as we will see Friday night, sometimes the devil literally is in the details. What does Jesus tell Peter to do? When Jesus starts to tell the disciples, hey, look, by the way, part of being the Messiah is that I'm going to suffer and be crucified. And Peter, who, we oftentimes criticize Peter like we wouldn't have done the very same thing that he did. But Peter, according to church tradition, is the oldest of the disciples. And Peter is the one who just got this confession right, according to Jesus. So Peter takes Jesus aside and says, have you lost your ever-loving mind? This is not going to happen to you. And Jesus pretty sternly says, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have the interests of God in mind, but only human interests. What did Jesus just say to Peter? He just said, this confession comes from God. And now he's saying, yeah, you're thinking humanly, not in the ways that God would think. Look, sometimes we have expectations of God. And sometimes those expectations are not met. Sometimes, in fact, we are disappointed by what it is that God seems to be up to. Sometimes we're not sure He's up to anything at all. I mean, let's remember this Peter who confessed Jesus in chapter 16 will in chapter 26 deny Jesus. He'll do the very opposite of what he has done here. Not only will he say, oh no, Jesus isn't the Messiah, he'll say, I don't even know the guy. It is a painful repudiation. And Peter's lack of understanding lead him not only to disappoint Jesus, but to disappoint himself. We can fall into that same trap. We can wake up one day and just go, how did I get here? It happened to the Christians in Germany after the Second World War. It happened to the Christians in Rwanda. I will never forget hearing there was a particular pastor in Rwanda that said, I can't explain what happened to us other than this, that a darkness descended over our eyes. They were deeply, deeply deceived, and genocide was the result. So how do we avoid all of this? How do we not find ourselves in that place? How do we not get off track in terms of our vision of what God might be doing? Well, I think the way we do that is we ask ourselves some questions. I've got 4 here that are on the screen, but you could probably come up with more. But let's walk through these 4. First of all, is our vision of what God is up to triumphalist or redemptive? In other words, are we looking forward to how God will have victory over His enemies, or are we looking forward to how God will redeem the world? how God will, in fact, demonstrate His love to His enemies so that they turn to Him. That's why psychologist Jim Wilder reminds every crowd that he speaks to, when you see someone who is acting like your enemy or God's enemy, it's not just because they're an evil person. They may be an evil person. I mean, we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, it may be because they're an evil person, but it's also because they are lacking something absolutely vital in their lives. And I'm sure, as Jeff Holzclaw would remind us, it's probably either intimacy or agency or both. So but here's the thing. So often when we get hurt, when we get angry, all we really want is vengeance. And there's nothing wrong with wanting God to avenge the evils that have been done in our world. Paul never says that vengeance is wrong. He simply says vengeance is God's, not ours. Okay? The second question that we need to ask ourselves is, does our vision for the future, for what God is going to do in the world, really focus only on ourselves, on the people who look like us or belong to our group or whatever, or does it reflect God's heart for the world? Now, I'm about to say something that might offend some of you. But this is a foundational point to my own theology and my own analysis of history. It is a non-negotiable for me, okay? And I believe that it is a non-negotiable for the gospel. There is no such thing as a Christian nation, not in the way that Israel was the people of God. God's work is transnational. Now, we know that historically, okay? Baylor University has done some really good research showing that church membership at the Revolutionary War period was less than 20%. Even by 1850, it was less than 1/3. Church membership didn't really start to shoot up until after the Civil War. So de-churching is nothing new for the United States of America. We've been there before. And not only that, but we need to remember that there's no such thing as an idealized past either. We'll come back to that point in a few minutes, but let's just remember our own history. In the 19th century, we were enslaving an entire race of people and then driving another entire race of people off their land. Now, it's not that we're better now than we were then. We've just changed sins. We've just traded one group of sins for another. That's not my point. And the secular historians who say that the United States has no connection with Christianity, they're full of it too. It remains to be seen, and I don't think it can be done, but it remains to be seen whether you can even do what we call liberal democracy without Christian values. This whole experiment in a free people with a free church can only work to the extent that we accept the foundational values that are taught to us by the Christian faith. But that is not the same thing as saying we're going to make America Christian again. No, the vision of God is transnational. And every time some refugee lands at DFW Airport from Tajikistan or Iran or wherever, that's an opportunity for us to share the gospel. As Ray Bakke wrote 30 years ago, we can't go to Tehran and start handing out tracts. You'll end up dead or in an Iranian prison. But when they come here, we can do that, right? We just have to have the vision to see that this is God's heart. Third question, is your vision for the future utopian or realistic? That's not just a good question to ask about the past. Oh, by the way, one of my favorite lines from Dr. Tony Evans. Literally, Dr. Evans has had white pastors come up to him and say, man, don't you wish that the world was more like it was in the 1950s? How do you think that sounds to him? He's not going for that, is he? Right. So the past isn't utopian, but neither is the future. And here's the point that Mike Cosper of Christianity Today has been making a lot lately. If you have a utopian vision of the future, you are one short step from revolutionary violence. We saw it in Nazi Germany. We've seen it in communist movements around the world. We've seen it in what's called Islamofascism. Once you sort of get this idea that if we can just do X, we can create a perfect world. What happens? Well, the do X part is usually if we can just get rid of these people who are opposing our agenda. And folks, there are lots of people in the United States, many of them sitting in Bible-believing churches just like ours, who think, well, if we could just get rid of all those liberals, this would be an ideal country. This would be a God-honoring country. And it's not just us. There's lots of people on the left who are also saying, if we could just get rid of those nutbag fundamentalists, this would be an ideal country. Folks, that is a recipe for bloodshed. Is our vision utopian or realistic? We can be involved in the challenges that face our world. We can say, listen, God calls us to justice. And this is what we think justice means in this context, whether it be in our own streets or in Ukraine, whether it be in our own hospitals or in Israel or Gaza, wherever it might be, whether it be in Sweden or Myanmar. We can say, God calls the world to justice. And here's what we as the church believe that means. But that's a different thing than saying, hey, if we could just get rid of all of X people, we could have an ideal world. That's how just scores and scores and scores and scores of people end up dead. And why is that? Because Alexander Solzhenitsyn was right. The line between good and evil runs right through the middle of your heart and mine. Final question that I have, you might come up with more diagnostic questions, but the final question I have is, are we really trying to just do God's vision our way? Or more accurately, are we trying to implement our vision and get God to sign up for it? Are we trying to shape the future in accordance, I should say, with our strength and our wisdom? Or are we in humility submitting our lives, our dreams, our futures, our hopes to Jesus and letting Him do it His way? Now, by the way, that doesn't mean we're always going to agree with how He's doing it. Sometimes how Jesus does it is painful. Sometimes how Jesus does it is inexplicable to us. We just don't get what He's up to. That's okay. We got a whole book in the Bible about that. It's called Psalms. And if you read those Psalms with eyes wide open, you'll realize, hey, sometimes I've felt this way. Sometimes I've just wanted to come to God and give Him a good old-fashioned cussing. And you know what? God's big enough to take it. Now, I don't recommend it. And I don't mind confessing to you that I've done it. So I have the experience to tell you that I don't recommend it. But you know what? He's big enough to take it, and He's not going to throw you out of His kingdom on your ear because you're upset with Him. He loves you, and He loves you even when you're misguided, even when you get it wrong, even when you're on the wrong track. He loves you. But He also doesn't want you misshaping, misconstruing, misapplying His vision for your own purposes. Let us pray.